Hello. Hello, everyone. No. Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, okay. Please, thank you very much. We are going to start. Of course, welcome to all of you. Francesca and Marit, our co-chairs, will say hello to all of you, and then we start. Thank you very much.
Welcome to all here in the venue and the people who are online. We are very excited about these events and what we will hear and listen to and thought about. And I really wish to have a beautiful meeting of mind with the lecture we will have. And now, Marit, go.
So I want to also say good evening and welcome to all of you. For me, in such turbulent times, it is good to see you here and be here. I want to share with you something. I woke up this morning from a dream that probably has a wider relevance, so I thought I would like to share it with you. We, myself and my partner, were invited to a celebration of the birth of a friend's granddaughter. We entered the room through a relatively small entrance. People were sitting along the walls on chairs, and there was no free chair except the big chair in the corner on which traditionally the grandfather would sit holding the newborn baby during the ceremony. I found a place to stand in the corner beside this chair, but then rethinking, decided that this wasn't proper place because I didn't want to get into the frame of the photographer shooting the ceremony. I then saw that there was a free piece of wall with no chairs and decided to sit on the floor, not sure if that was proper either, but that was the only vacancy, and I usually like to sit on the ground. My partner didn't think it was appropriate. In our Jewish tradition, we sit on the floor when mourning those who have died, whereas this was a celebration in honor of a new baby girl. I woke up with this feeling of ambivalence. This year, our Foulkes lecture event is happening in times that carry a unique and intricate significance. The weight of mourning and sorrow that many of us, including myself, hold or intervened with worries and fears bears heavily upon us. At this time, there dawns within us a profound awareness of our substantial responsibility to enact change, to take action, and to inspire hope for a better future. We have given our next in-person event, GASi Summer School in Torino, the theme of Transform Action. Since we are here in the traditional Foulkes lecture in London for the memory of Foulkes' legacy, I want to send my respect to our German colleagues for filling one empty space, a memorial plaque for S.H. Foulkes, the founder of group analysis in GASi, who was born in Karlsruhe, Germany, was donated by the German Society of Group Analysis and Group Psychotherapy, This plaque was installed on last October 26 at the German Jewish constellation on the path of group analysis outside his home in Frankfurt, where Foulkes and his family lived until the Nazi seized power in 1933 that forced him out and made him immigrate to England, changing his name to Michael. I will end with his words that have been inscribed on the plaque. If you look after the group will look after the individual. I wish us all a nice evening. Thank you.
Well, as a chair of the scientific committee, I want to thank our speakers, Kevin Power and Inge Hudson. And tomorrow we will say hello to the others. But today we are listening to them, both of them, with their very interesting work. And it was a pleasure to work with them and to stay in this process. Yes, nothing more. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
So it falls onto me to introduce our 47th Foulkes lecturer, our dear colleague, Kevin Power. Kevin came to our profession from Anglo-Irish family background with a Catholic mother from Northern Ireland and an atheist father from East London. So that's and he first worked as a school teacher for many years before training as a group analyst at the now defunct program of the London Centre for Psychotherapy group program. He founded the Goldsmiths. He convened for many years the Goldsmiths group analytic training. And he was also the chair of the 2011 London GASi Symposium. Kevin also is the executive editor of the journal Group Analysis, and also the GASi honorary treasurer.
No longer honorary treasurer.
Formerly, but or archivist.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Is that my cue?
Yes.
Okay. You're going to have a text up on the video screen, and I'll warn you now that I did make a few slight changes, but they are very slight. This lecture is called On the Impulse to Impart. After initial hesitation when invited to present this annual lecture, I decided to look again at an area that has interested me in recent years. This presentation is about communication and language, their parts in group analysis, how they have originated, and how they may be used contemporarily. It is to Foulkes' memory and achievement that we celebrate this evening. Communication is a fundamental group analytic theme, one on which Foulkes laid considerable emphasis across all his published work and doubtless in his practice. Let me start, though, with our hosts, the King's Fund. This institution was founded in 1897 by the future King Edward VII to raise money for London's voluntary hospitals, the health institutions of that era, which offered medical assistance to the sick and dying who had no funds in London for private treatment. In 1984, this fund generously provided money, along with many individual contributions, to help establish the jointly owned King's Fund Library of the GASi and IGA, London, at 1 Daleham Gardens, which is used by members of both organisations and by those in training. I believe the creation and existence of this library and those who donated to it needs greater acknowledgement. Recognition of the existence and use of the King's Fund Library as the group analytic reference room seems appropriate today when speaking here about language and communication. So what's in a name? Foulkes' original name in German was Foulkes, which in English is fox. This reminds me of Isaiah Berlin's playful essay, The Fox and the Hedgehog, in which he quotes from the Greek poet Archilochos line that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. I think Fox knew many small things against the background, the gestalt of knowing one big thing. He might at times apparently roll himself into a hedgehog ball and declare, with a smile, I am not budging. Yet his one big thing is obviously group analysis, and that sitting people together in structured groups brings them into communication and relation with one another for their mutual and contrasting benefit. One of his more famous sentences is, in full, the work thus to be done, the impulse for which is the result of a quite unconscious process of selection by pressure of suffering, and an equally unconscious selective quality of group pressure, this working towards an ever more articulate form of communication is, however, identical with the therapeutic process itself. Those last phrases insist that the more candidly articulate that group members become, the more they are involved in therapeutic process. It is not solely an emotional unlearning experience he is presenting members with, but also one of improving communication of all kinds and increasingly via language. He sought communication in a permissive atmosphere. This was due to his belief that honest communication cuts through the straitjacket of alienated individuality that capital and industrialism over the past 300 years and more has foisted upon humanity to our collective detriment. The impulse to impart, the drive to communicate, I consider to be almost the equivalent of a Freudian drive, something that is indelibly inscribed in human life and response, something that we all do every day without hardly ever thinking it in any way unusual or odd, and occasionally surprising ourselves with what may become known as Freudian slips. I almost made one. All of us fulfills the joint roles of transmitter and receiver for our entire lives. Consider a world where communication is curtailed and limited and subject to much self-censorship and societal and legal restriction. George Orwell's novel 1984 and its forebears comes at once to mind. Orwell warned of the corruption of language regularly in his work. The fear of the power of words is simply demonstrated whenever a demagogue comes to power. The poets and writers are rounded up along with political opponents. Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria comes to mind. Hong Kong's free bookshops have all been closed by the current revanchist Chinese government. And in the 17th century of England, merely speaking about atheism could bring a sentence of death by hanging. When the demands of superego are unchallenged and communication at all levels falters or is eliminated, people get ill, begin ailing in ways that are so widespread as the imposed censorship, as then to appear part of accepted normality. People suffer alone and are denied the benefits of open-ended, candid, and communal speech. Internal and external worlds regularly run parallel courses. Language, I believe, can in time outpace such tyrannies and upset Orwell's pessimism. In all his writings, Foulkes, instigator of group analysis, emphasized the need for human communication to become ever more open among members of any group that had been brought together for the purposes of psychotherapy, and to achieve this ultimately through language. his written output has examples throughout. For instance, the neurotic patient must learn to formulate in words his ineluctable experiences and to find someone to listen to. I love the word ineluctable. The patient's struggle takes place in the sphere of communication and has to be fought out there if therapy is to be effective. And lastly, helping to alleviate suffering by ventilation and understanding, but in addition with uncovering unconscious conflicts and paving the way for their resolution, and based therefore ultimately on verbal forms of communication and not acting. Dalal sums up Foulkes' belief when he writes, Foulkes goes even so far as to derive mind itself from the need to communicate, that it is the impulse or desire to communicate that gives rise to the mind. In other words, the first reason for the emergence of mind is to function as transmitter and receiver of communication. And I add to this that mind can be viewed as both an individual and a group phenomenon. The great emphasis of the past 300 years of Western history on individuality has built a societal superstructure that neglects humanity's socially interactive foundations. Consequently, a great deal of psychic disturbance, illness, originates with the neglect of group involvement and group identity. The current epoch of individuality also insists that whatever the mental or psychological disturbance is, it must be counteracted very largely by medications that are personally ingested and treatments that are individually targeted and administered, and not in group simulacrums of where and how such disturbance has evolved. I think this trend is regressive and roughly a mirror image of the urge to greater productivity that propels larger society. Recently, a member who had been in my therapy group for a few months said with a kind of generous exasperation, gosh, all this stuff you hear on the news about bad mental health and there's no treatment and so on. Well, it's all here, isn't it? Gesturing to the group. Here's what I need. Foulkes emphasized how psychotherapy was not about the relief of symptoms or the curing of disturbance. Instead, he argued that what people lacked was the opportunity over time to say what had been unable to express before in their lives, and to say these unsayable things to a limited, confidential audience who were interacting together and sharing the same terms of membership and boundaries. Communicating and listening to others doing likewise, interacting with them so as to achieve shared, contrasting understanding. Foulkes' new paradigm for understanding psychological distress exposed group members' learnt superego restrictions on expression through language and not nervous or chemical or physiological abnormality as the roots of distress. Symptomatic autistic mumbling masked the hindrance on linguistic expression and communication, and this preceded any other demonstration of disturbance. What knowledge is there for considering that communicating via spoken language is an impulse, a vital need, as Foulkes argued? It's worth recalling Dr. Pratt, 1907 in the USA, who brought together patients suffering from tuberculosis to explain how to manage the sputum that their disease produced in them. He allowed patients to speak with one another in his sessions and found that their condition began to improve. Bacterial diseases will not be cured by speech, but speaking helps improve patients' state of morale. Expression, at the least, brought relief as shared understanding enabled an intellectual and emotional response. Noam Chomsky. In his first career as a linguist, working at Massachusetts Institute for Technology, Noam Chomsky published Syntactic Structures, in which he hypothesized that language relied on certain brain structures that were part of every human's genetic inheritance, that each brain possessed an internal grammar mechanism. Only it had been noted that unless these brain structures had been stimulated by a language community by the age of around 7, that facility would slowly decline in its potential for each individual. Steve Pinker, Chomsky's colleague, along with others, has argued for language as an evolutionary outcome of a Darwinian nature. What might be the basis for this? Hypotheses exist that posit that the increases in brain size in our hominid ancestors are linked to the betterment of diet over very many millennia. Eating raw meat was a first step, followed by further increase in brain size after the adoption and control of fire, which brought about cooked meat after hominids discovered that cooked meat tastes better than raw. These foods also interacted with digestive systems to provide 1 hour to digest food, in contrast to the 10 hours required for raw meat. I haven't tried this. Increases in hominid brain size took place over immense periods of time, though in evolutionary terms quite quickly, due to the interaction of natural and cultural adaptations. When might those language brain structures have begun to evolve then, to speak for themselves? Paleoanthropologists estimates are between 50 and 110,000 years ago. Yet there is evidence found in recent years to suggest a much earlier start to language. The Scheningen spears. In the mid-1990s, 10 Paleolithic wooden spears were unearthed at a lignite mine in Germany near the town of Scheningen. You should be able to see that. There aren't 10, they only got the best ones. They were about 2 meters in length, found among thousands of horse and other animal bones. Thermoluminescence dating assessed them being around 325,000 years old, which makes them the oldest surviving wooden tools unearthed, bar one. The spears were crafted, functionally weighted like the design of modern athletes' javelins, so as to provide good flight, and which brings them down point first. Wooden replicas of these spears have been thrown by athletes up to 30 meters. The points were of the harder rootwood, while the shafts were offset from the vertical center, which avoided the spear splitting. The people who made these spears with stone tools used them for hunting and will also have had to cooperate in trapping the animals involved. Their construction and use say a great deal about how hominids concerned, who were probably Neanderthals. Quotes, the Scheningen humans therefore likely had cognitive skills such as anticipatory planning, thinking, and acting, some of which had only previously been attributed to modern humans. In addition, the spears have played a major role in debates about the origins of throwing. Such qualities require complex communication skills and strongly suggest at the least a rudimentary language of sounds and meanings that conveyed much more than gesture might alone accomplish. Discerning all these qualities of wood outlined above implies a considerable ability to reason and think together as a group. Jane Abercrombie reminds us that free group discussion is to thinking, ideas and abstractions, as handling things is to perception. And 64 years later, cultural critic Terry Eagleton has this to say: handling things leads to group discussion. If the above is broadly accepted, the upper limit of 110,000 years ago for the commencement of language seems quite restricted. Wiesner's research. Peoples in the present world who have avoided an imposed civilization are very few and very small in numbers. Those who have avoided pastoralism, agriculture, and industrialism are known as hunter-gatherers or foragers. One place where hunter-gatherers can be found only semi-assimilated into Western culture is in Southwest Africa, in Botswana and Namibia. In the early 1970s, anthropologist Professor Polly Wiesner of Utah University researched how two bands of foraging people living in KK, I think that's the right pronunciation, in Botswana, used time for various themes in their conversations. In her paper, The Embers of Society, she describes this research made when staying with two groups of the GASi people. She carefully noted what they spoke about as a group and at what times of the day. And we should see this coming up on the screen. I'll read this out quickly. Land rights in the morning discussions were recorded as land rights 9%, inter-ethnic matters 4%, stories 6%, economic matters 31%, joking 16%, and complaints 34%. She noted that these discussions often left unresolved tensions between participants, while the needs of the day had nevertheless to be met. In the evening of the same day, all would gather again around fires in the encampment, and Wiesner again noted the topics of discussion. These results were virtually the inverse of the morning. 2% land rights, interethnic matters 2%, complaints 7%, economic matters 4%, myth, a new category, 4%, and stories 81%. Just compare the stories categories. Night times were the times of storytelling. These were all noted across approximately 8 weeks in 2 time periods and among 2 bands of GASi. Following evening eating, lit by firelight, came conversation on what had been experienced that day that influenced the ambience of the warm nights, with a different quality of interaction ensuing, where stories and recollections of known people were regularly told, often concerning what had been spoken of in the morning's work meeting. If marriage, for instance, had been tersely discussed that morning, the evening might include stories about marriage, which were listened to intently and which produced laughter or awe or murmurs of agreement. Wiesner says, the capacity for expanding the imagination by night may have deep roots extending back to the regular use of fire in encampments some 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, a time when evidence for broader intergroups begins to crop up in the archaeological record. I wonder if those Neanderthalers near Schöningen who made those spears did something similar to what Wiesner describes. They knew about fire, though possibly not how to originate it. They likely had language for planning and for stories also for sharing the day's deeds and transforming their relations with one another. Wiesner suggests that in the subdued lighting of a fire, with stars and moon illuminating the night sky above southern Africa, the group's members repaired discord from the preceding daylight hours with narrative, working in a group of between 15 and 40 people, including children. Wiesner weights her argument by quoting a different indigenous culture. She adds, as Benson Lewis, a Chibeque Apache, put it, stories go to work on you like arrows. Stories make you live right. Stories make you replace yourself. To me, this seems like a use of language that resembles closely some of the process of group analysis, where heightened tensions are realized and the reconciling of such tensions takes place via forms of storytelling. A communal discourse begun probably hundreds of thousands of years before. Benson Lewis's remark, "Stories make you replace yourself," points to the well-rooted belief in the remaking of the individual over time by a narrative. As with group analysis, such storytelling happens while the meta story of the group is itself being forged. Myth and legend blend in with the band's current story. In her research, Wiesner mentions how stories brought in named individuals who lived a great distance away. We should see this diagram here. This diagram shows the distance that people could be talked about in these discussions, that distance away, up to 200 kilometers away, just sitting around that particular fire of an evening. The diagram shows this, how named individuals whom Wiesner heard of in these stories could live up to 200 kilometers away. Links with them at that time were maintained only by walking. She has described a diurnal pattern of group living. Wiesner adds, data from modern foragers cannot be projected back to interpret the distant past. These data can, however, give us a realistic sense of what practices work for foragers and why, a sense of what could be accomplished in a firelit niche, and grounds to formulate questions and hypotheses regarding the impact of firelight on social and cultural evolution. This example of recent interaction among GASi shows how involving group life is. They live group life each and every day of their lives. Our largely alienated manner of living makes us turn from each other towards our screens, and electric light makes a room immediately bright or dark. From the GASi and other foraging peoples, we might uncover more group-like ways to live, sharing childcare more easily and fully, and evenings with each other. A proven hypothesis? Foulkes was 9 years ahead of Chomsky in his insistence on language as an essential human quality, discovered via psychotherapy, Chomsky's via linguistics. When each proposed their hypotheses on language and communication, they both lacked any proof for them. Yet the year after Foulkes' death, an unwitting experiment began in Nicaragua that appeared to confirm both their hypotheses. In 1977, the education authorities in Nicaragua's capital, Managua, brought together in a school 50 severely deaf children between 9 and 12 years of age, who had little beyond rudimentary ability to communicate with their families. Educational aims were to teach them lip reading and speaking, known as the oralist approach, the results of which, Pinker assures us, are always dismal. However, the staff did notice that over time, the children were developing a signing amongst themselves, but did little to encourage or examine it. Following the Sandinista revolution and government of 1979, by which time the initial tranche of deaf children had increased to about 100, the new education authorities found a further 350 deaf children in the city and among the outlying villages aged between 4 and 6 years. Once again, these young children were not enthusiastic about the oralist lessons. Hang on, there we go. However, the staff this time, who were now largely drawn from the German Democratic Republic, did notice this second and much larger intake of deaf children had started signing among themselves, based a little on what they saw practiced by the initial 50 to 100 older pupils. Eventually, in 1986, the staff team invited signing expert Professor Judy Cagle from the MIT, where she had taken her doctorate under Chomsky, who had been working in Nicaragua post-1979 and had recommended her, to help them investigate and evaluate what was happening with the children in charge. Declaring she had no intention of introducing American Sign Language, Dr. Cagle arrived in June '86 and lived in Managua for some time while she explored what was going on. She was shown the initial 50 to 100 children, now in their mid-teens, and attending a vocational school. She judged this signing was not at a full language level. However, once introduced to the younger 350, now into 6 years of developing their own unique sign language, she was amazed. I was seeing language, I was seeing grammar, and it was very clear, said Shepherd Keel. What became increasingly obvious to her was that these children had, via the impulse to impart, devised their own thoroughgoing sign language that met the definition of any language, signed or spoken. Complex and idiosyncratic messages and meanings could be shared among people. In the playgrounds, on the streets, and on the school buses, the large group of 350 had put together for themselves a fully operational sign language that contained all that any language requires. Nouns and pronouns, verb agreement, word order, past, present, and future tenses, as phrases, clauses, and sentences. All of which seem to confirm Chomsky's universal grammar that he proposed exists for all human languages. Steven Pinker, author of The Language Instinct, claims that the Nicaraguan case is absolutely unique in history. We've been able to see how it is that children, not adults, generate language, and we have been able to record it happening in great scientific detail. And it's the only time that we've actually seen a language being created out of thin air. The children involved have been virtually without language and with sparse communicative involvement in their own families due to their deafness and lack of opportunity with others. They were potential receivers who were unable to transmit. Collecting them together to teach them basic communication enabled them to interact with a large group and to construct their own signing language unselfconsciously. This has now been officially acknowledged as Nicaraguan Sign Language, ISN, one of many sign languages, yet one of the very few examples of a sign language being invented by those who required it and who became its main protagonists. Now let's listen to Judy Cagle for 2 minutes, as well as to the children, we hope.
Everybody know this was something that
Turn
needed
up.
to be documented. Prior to the 1980s, deaf people were very isolated in Nicaragua. All they had was a handful of gestures, something like, I want to eat, or I feel sick, or I have to go to the bathroom. I mean, just gestures that were used in the family. In the early 1980s, with a new focus on education for everyone, deaf people were brought into schools, but no one really knew a whole lot about how to teach them.
The school brought in teachers from East Germany to try to teach the students to lip read, but it was a dismal failure, as they simply didn't understand what was going on. However, between the students themselves, something startling had begun to happen. They were finding their own way to communicate.
They suddenly had the need to communicate.
The students had started signing to each other, and their signing developed so fast that it was soon too complicated for the teachers to follow by guesswork. The expert they were sent was American linguist Judy Cagle.
What I asked them was, what do you want? What do you want here in the school? What do you need? And their answer was, we need to understand what those deaf kids are talking about.
When I first went down, I saw communication that was very hard for me as a linguist to get a handle on. When you looked for what the sentence structure was, each person was different. There was a lot of variability, but there was one very dominant language user named Mayela.
We're all deaf here and we've grown up together. As you can see, we're all good friends.
And as I watched her, I saw the sort of full-blown consistency, the facial expression, the rhythm, the assurance of being understood. And the same was true for all the kids around her. And I realized, whoa, the emergence of new languages is not unknown, but It's never been the case that someone has actually been able to film, document, and follow the process of what the human brain is doing with language.
Okay, that's your video. This strongly suggests that all are born with the same genetically installed capacity for universal grammar, shared by all humans, and along with all other speakers of language, needed group social interaction to become active and developmentally expressive. The older first 50 to 100 children demonstrated less ingenuity in creating their sign language, as they were likely past the apex of their facility for language.
Kevin, wait a moment. Alex, the microphone. Thank you.
Is that working now? Okay. Well, facility for language, if not used from as early as possible, whether signed or spoken, the potential for language falls away. Jane Abercrombie wrote, "Our methods of formal education are still governed by a notion that children's little heads are empty, or at least emptier than they should be. Whereas the truth is that it is because they are too full of what we do not understand that they are difficult to teach." I think that the Nicaraguan experience vindicates Foulkes' repeated assertion on humanity being essentially a communicating and transmitting species. The corollary of this is that if humans aren't transmitting and receiving and communicating, then they and their social groups are ailing, and probably also is the large group beyond family and local community. If we consider the ever-increasing use of screens for communicating across huge distances, will this now seem like an additional ailment? At first glance, the answer is no. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when much of the world's population stayed at home and only screen communication beyond was possible or even allowed, billions were able to maintain spoken and visual contact via screens and audio. Are there communication restrictions, diminishments in the quality of human interactions? Well, other communication channels such as smell and physical gesturing, intended or not, could not be fully appreciated as screens cannot replicate humans in the round. A flat screen is not a circle of chairs. Rather, we are looking at language with gesture and other senses in shared physical presence as a site for full communication. Signing languages entail linguistic exchange via physical gesturing, though it can take place effectively via a screen. Chomsky argued that via the limited set of rules of universal grammar, humans produce a limitless range of sentences and meanings. These syntactic structures are triggered in groups, hence the limitless range of themes that are raised during groups that meet over years. Restrictions in life known as symptoms might alternatively be named restrictions in expressive language. Numbers and beyond. A clause as a part of a sentence contains at least a subject and a verb. Acting together, clauses are the component parts of any sentence and convey meaning. In order to maintain comprehension, Chomsky judged the upper limit of clauses of number of clauses in a sentence to be 5 plus or minus 2. Anything beyond 5 plus or minus 2 clauses meant that cognitive understanding declined or became confused. Now, 5 is also the minimum number in a group for the activation of the group analytic process, where members can no longer maintain a rational grasp of what is being spoken, and unconscious process has much more freedom to influence and act and react. I think there may be a link between this number of subsidiary clauses in a sentence that can be understood by the individual, a range hardwired into language brain structures, and the number of persons in a group who are needed to impel the group analytic process. At that number and above, over time, cognitive understanding falls away and unconscious process gains ground. All of the above links to the quality of recursion in language. That is the ability of humans to be able to follow complex sentences where reference can be made to clauses yet to come or clauses that have been spoken or written already. It is this quality in language that separates humans from non-human communication systems. I have used recursion throughout this paper, even in this paragraph. We speak regularly in this manner. And then the listener may reach the end of personal understanding and request the speaker to, hold on, I think I lost you. Could you say that again? Perhaps I might have done this tonight. Language is a group invention. It is a genetically installed, yet communally fired, uniquely human phenomenon. In Managua, it took a group of 400 children to build a language. The range of different sentences that one individual can generate through a lifetime via Chomsky's hypothetical universal grammar is endless. The potential for creativity that everyone possesses is present every minute through language and sentence making. The creativity of dreams mixes linguistic uniqueness with visual weirdness. Linguistic uniqueness, yeah, a bit complex. I've lost myself there. Much of this might only be within one's head, so that when becoming a group member, a situation exists in which to speak those unuttered sentences as fantasies, dreams, hitherto censored thoughts, reactions and feelings, and consider them in context with others. Over time, group facilitators become alert to unforced changes in the phrasing of members' contributions, and that these signal expansion in the individual's mindset and symbolism, as well as in the groups as a whole. The impulse to impart, this drive to communicate, is most likely forged through the need to survive by our distant ancestors, by the several increases in brain size identified over very many millennia. This includes free time that allows for playing in the sense of free association with objects, human and non-human. This is accompanied by gesture and speech, each stage bringing further interaction among those sharing generations of encampments, when the story of the day's work of good enough survival has been shared around the fire as narrative. A sensuality of taste needs expressing, will make a sound, make a repeated sound, make a word. As brains increased in size, communicability did also. With improved digestion and food value, hominids had more time and energy to accomplish this. Hunter-gatherers are known for their relaxed attitude towards scarcity of food, certain they would discover it in 2 or 3 days. Humans have developed with time to spare, which they have used to interact with each other and with the materials of the world. A free associative approach to their living, the quality of which the current overwhelming emphasis on productiveness steals from this planet. Among his inner circle of followers, Foulkes was notorious for declaring that he had no need of other theories and practices, apart perhaps from Freud, asserting this regularly with confidence. Might these have been his hedgehog moments? In his first book, he declared that it is in the process of communication and the struggle for it that all other dynamisms meet. This sums up, for me, his confidence in the method he had practiced and expounded. The term dynamisms suggests not only all that members bring unconsciously, but also those that the facilitator brings by his training. The free associative struggle for communication is the work of psychotherapy and change within groups and beyond them. Effective psychotherapy frees the individual so that one can exercise the full range of one's abilities, known and unknown, within and beyond the sphere of human activity. Whatever else the turning world brings, I think this remains true. Thank you for your attention.
you. Kevin's respondent tonight is Inge Hudson, and she is a retired group analyst and clinical psychologist. She has extensive experience as a practitioner with groups and individuals, both within the NHS and also at the Women's Therapy Centre, London, and in private practice. She has taught on many training courses, courses for both psychologists and psychotherapists, this in the UK and in Germany. And she was a training group analyst for the IGA and also at GASi in Germany. Inge.
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Kevin for inviting me to respond to his lecture. While he was writing his lecture, we had some conversations, and all the rich material from what was to become his lecture evoked a whole range of responses in me regarding different languages and cultures and how the barriers to communication between them might be overcome. See, I've gone hoarse already. His image of the Grohanzi people in Botswana and Namibia around a fire in the evening, sharing experiences, stories, and recollections, brought to mind the yarning circles of the Australian Aboriginal people, of which I had only recently heard. And I want to thank Jackie Davis and my Cambridge Yarning Circle for telling me about them. Yarning circles have been used by Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for thousands of years and consist of a set of circles or concentric circles where people come together. This can be around a fire, but often also around a waterhole, these being critical to survival in a desert environment. Here is a definition of yarning. Listen carefully. The practice of yarning and yarning circles broadly consists of storytelling within a respectful and deeply democratic space where each participant takes turns in speaking and in which the direction of discussion may meander, fixate, or take divergent and creative lines of flight. Sounds familiar? So maybe Foulkes didn't invent group analysis after all. It seems that the seeds of something like the groups described here have already been present in our foundation matrix, which according to Foulkes is based on the biological properties of the species, that is, the existence of genetically inherited brain structures that are specific to the production of language, as well as the impulse to impart, which Kevin has suggested is akin to a Freudian drive. Sharing our stories with others is a way of making sense of our lived experience, which has probably gone on from times immemorial. And what is most interesting is that our way of understanding our stories, and therefore the stories themselves, changes as the result of being shared with others. The feedback, interpretation, and mirroring that we receive from others enables us to see them in a new way, and the stories therefore become part of our evolving culture. That is our way of seeing and understanding each other as a human group, as well as a way of passing on and remembering our history. The word history, of course, contains within it the word story, and this is true of many other languages. For example, in German, the word for story, Geschichte, and the word for history are the same word. And in English-speaking countries, we've had a new insight, which is that his story is also her story. Thus, our way of understanding ourselves and our culture can gradually evolve. I now want to go back to the yarning circles of the Australian Aboriginal peoples and report that as part of Australia's evolving culture, yarning is now being used as a way of establishing communication between First People, that is the descendants of the original inhabitants and the descendants of the white settlers. Here is a quote from an article by Dr. Wayne Atkinson, who is a Yorta traditional owner. A traditional owner being a person whose ancestors lived on or had connection to a particular area of land before Europeans arrived. He explains, the concept of yarning and healing circles is primarily aimed at bringing people together to share knowledge and to heal past historic and systemic injustices. They also have a reconciliating function of creating harmony and mutual acceptance within a shared space. Dr. Atkinson goes on to describe how at the Dania Centre in Victoria, visitors sit together on the land in a learning circle facilitated by the original owners. Can we have the picture? No. Oh, okay, that's just me.
It's on there. It's on. In the other side.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Good,
Inge,
good.
and there.
And there. Oh, very good. Okay. Here are some statements from Australian First People. This one is from a Miriam Elder. The land actually gave birth to our language. Language and culture are inseparable. And another one. If our language survives, we survive as Walpiri people. Our language keeps us strong. It has always kept us strong. And finally, when I was a child, we had to keep our language secret. Today, we are relearning our language, ensuring that we, the Nungwa, are the knowledge keepers of our language. These quotes illustrate how language, identity, and culture are inextricably interlinked. While the last quote illustrates the struggle for a language to survive within a context of a more powerful and dominant language group. It's interesting that yarning circles are also being used now as a way of decolonizing research. This is a way of doing qualitative research that recognizes the validity of Indigenous methodologies and which gives a central place to Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing research in a way that is collaborative and relational. The image of sitting in a circle and on the land is a powerful one. A circle is a democratic structure, unlike the lecture room and unlike the little windows that appear on our screens, which were described by one online activist as connected solitude. Australian Aboriginal languages are a unique language group with no connection to any other language in the world, which must be the result of geographical isolation originally. There are about 150 still spoken, each rooted in a particular place and associated with a particular tribal group. The fact that a completely unique language was created in a place which was at the time isolated and cut off from the rest of the planet makes me think again of the deaf children of Nicaragua and the idea that there may be an infinite possible number of languages which could be or could have been created in an infinite number of existing and theoretically possible human groups. I think that's quite a thought. There are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. So how are we to communicate with one another in our increasingly globalized and endangered world? How are we to understand one another? One way, of course, is through interpreters and the process of translating the words of one language into the words of another. But we have to remember that this involves much more than the literal translation of words. It also and vitally involves the translation of cultural and historical meanings, as well as resonance and atmosphere. A precise translation from one language to another is impossible in any case, because we speak and think differently in different languages. Phyllis Cohen, working with groups in Russia, comments, perhaps the most difficult challenge is to translate a joke, to explain spontaneous laughter, and especially tears. In other words, we need to remember that as far as culture is concerned, and in our increasingly multicultural world, people may have different foundation matrices. This is important, even if group members are speaking the same language, and especially if some are speaking in a language which is not their mother tongue. The translation of language and culture can create a depth of mutual understanding which is very moving. It has been suggested by David Kennard and others that this may require a slowing down of the group process in order to create a space which would allow cultural material to be shared and historical and political references to be explained. This may impede the spontaneous flow of the group to some extent, but on the other hand, it may actually deepen and enrich communication. My own experience as a member of a multicultural group without a common language, where group members acted as interpreters for each other, confirms this. The process of translation did slow down the group process, but it was generally agreed that having to pause and participate in translating pushed group members into listening more carefully and thinking more deeply about the meaning of what was being communicated, rather than, as often happens, preparing their own response while the other person was still speaking. I spoke earlier of the important connection between language and geographical location. What does this mean for immigrants and refugees who make the journey from one country and the transition from one language to another? It is the journey made by Sigmund Heinrich Foulkes in 1933. And as Ken Bledden observed, it can't be an accident that he called the process of working towards an ever more articulate form of communication translation. It is also a journey I made myself as a child migrant from Germany to Australia. Our first language is so intimately tied up with our identity that the loss of it, or the inability to use it in our new environment, can feel like the loss of part of the self. Eva Hoffman, in her book Lost in Translation, a moving autobiographical account of emigrating from Poland to Canada as a child, describes the feelings of loss and alienation involved. She speaks of linguistic dispossession, which she felt was close to dispossession of the self, and agrees with Kevin when she states that if all therapy is speaking therapy, then perhaps all neurosis is speech dis-ease. Words without their many-layered emotional and cultural associations became just words, naked to me as the exposed girders of a building. The way we speak to ourselves in our first language may no longer be relevant to our new experiences. This can be confusing and disorienting. We may feel at a loss to grasp what is really meant or implied in this new context. Liesl Hurst, in her 1993 Foulkes lecture, gives an example of a man in one of her groups whose mother tongue was not English, but who spoke perfect English, but felt he could not understand what was going on and that he was stupid. I myself remember being introduced to my first English-speaking class in Australia as a little German girl who does not speak English. We must be kind to her. And wondering what the implications of the word kind were and who I was now in this new place. The process of absorbing and integrating a new language and culture into one's changed self takes time. There are losses, amongst them perhaps the fact that one may be to some extent an outsider now in both cultures. There are also gains. With the old associations stripped away, it may be possible to see some things more clearly. And there are major creative possibilities, as witnessed by the fact that group analysis itself was established by an immigrant and in a new language. I understand that Felix Korff will develop this theme in his talk tomorrow. As a bilingual person, I'm occasionally asked, what language do you think in then? What language do you dream in? The answer is that I now think and dream in both. Thank you.
Wow. Many thoughts, many things, maybe many languages. I think we can start and have a dialogue between us.